There's something about drought that doesn't just dry up land, it dries up hope. In the blistered stretch of rural Arkansas where Clay Turner scratched out a life, rain hadn't kissed the earth in over 4 weeks. The fields, once thick with soybean and sorghum, stood brittle and brown, whispering defeat every time the wind blew across their surface. Clay stood at the edge of his acreage, boots sunk into cracked soil, hat tugged low, watching as dust curled around his worn truck like a ghost refusing to leave. That truck, an old Ford F-150 held together more by grit than mechanics, had seen more of his life than most people ever did. It had hauled feed, tools, and once his late wife Anna, who used to ride beside him humming Patsy Cline with the windows down. Now it mostly carried silence, with the passenger seat faded from a sun no longer tempered by laughter. The day had started like most others, waking before light, coffee black and bitter, checking irrigation lines that refused to help what wouldn't grow. The bills stacked higher than the hay bales he couldn't afford to replenish. The bank had started calling again, soft-voiced women reading hard sentences about foreclosure timelines and alternative options. But Clay wasn't interested in options. This land was legacy, his father's sweat, his grandfather's bones. Letting go felt like betrayal. So when the car came limping up the gravel path, hissing smoke and coughing like a dying animal, Clay didn't expect anything more than a new headache. It was an Audi, silver, sleek, foreign, way too shiny for these roads. The door opened and out stepped a woman, mid-30s maybe, tall, long-legged in dusty jeans and expensive-looking boots. Her auburn hair was tied back but disheveled like it had fought wind for miles. Sunglasses hid her eyes, but her mouth was tight with frustration. "Excuse me," she called, walking toward him. Her voice was sharp, East Coast maybe, but edged, with something tired. "Is there a garage nearby?" Clay wiped his hands on his jeans, eyeing the car behind her. "Nearest shop's in Crowley, 20 miles out. That thing won't make 5. "I figured," she muttered, glancing back at the steaming hood. Then she faced him again, dropping the glasses. Her eyes were green. "Would you happen to have a phone?" Clay didn't move. "No signal out here. Satellite don't come this far unless you pay half a mortgage for it." Something flickered in her face. Frustration, maybe fear. She looked down at her boots, then back at him. "Could I borrow your truck, just to get into town? I'll bring it back, I'll even fill the tank." He studied her. From the gloss on her lips to the faint tremble in her fingers, she didn't belong here. Probably had money. Probably thought, kindness came cheap in small towns. "You don't even know me," Clay said. She raised a brow. "And you don't know me. But I'm stranded. I can pay, I just don't have cash on me right now." Clay hesitated. The truck was his lifeline. If she didn't come back, if she ran off with it, that'd be the end of everything. But her shoulders slumped a little, like the day had already won, and she didn't have anything left to prove. He reached into his back pocket, pulled out the keys, and held them out. "Don't make me regret it." She blinked, surprised, then nodded solemnly and took them. "Thank you, really." Clay watched her climb into the cab, adjust the mirror like she'd driven trucks before, and back out, slow down the gravel path. He stood there until the dust settled, until the road went quiet again. Back at the porch, Clay sat on the creaky swing with a cold can of beer and stared out at the horizon. His bones ached, his stomach clenched with unease, and his truck was gone. The sun slid lower, bleeding orange into the dusty horizon, but the truck didn't come back. Clay's knee bounced as he sat on the porch, trying to shake off the sense of foolishness gnawing at him. He'd given his last piece of working machinery to a stranger with designer boots and no small-town manners. What the hell was he thinking? That wasn't trust. That was desperation disguised as decency. Every crunch of gravel from the far ridge made his head snap up. But it was never her, just wind or squirrels or wishful thinking. He went back inside to fry 2 eggs and some toast. Anna would have made biscuits. She always said there was nothing a hot biscuit couldn't solve, even a bad harvest. Clay hadn't touched flour in months. The house was too quiet without the truck outside. It made the silence heavier, like the walls had closed in an inch or two. He turned on the old radio just to fill the space, some country station playing a song about heartbreak and old boots. He didn't know what bothered him more, that he'd let the truck go, or that he didn't ask the woman's last name. The sun was nearly gone when headlights finally appeared, bouncing over the gravel. Clay rose fast, squinting against the beams. The old Ford came rolling in like a faithful dog, quiet and low. It looked better, cleaner somehow. The engine purred instead of growled, and when it stopped, the woman stepped out, carrying a brown paper bag and a bottle of something dark in the crook of her arm. "I filled the tank," she said, holding the keys up. "Hope you don't mind. I ran it through the washer to gas station. Thought it deserved a rinse." Clay took the keys but said nothing. His eyes flicked to the truck, washed, polished. Tires looked topped off. She followed his gaze. "I figured it had been through enough," he grunted. "You bring it back, so that's something." "I said I would." She held up the bag. "And as thanks, I brought bourbon, the good stuff. Thought maybe you'd share a glass." He studied her face in the porch light. There was something different in it now, less rigid. The sunglasses were gone, and her green eyes looked tired in a human way. "Don't usually drink with strangers," he said. She shrugged. "You gave me your truck, figure we're past strangers." Clay cracked the screen door and stepped back. "Fine, but only one glass." They sat on the porch swing, each with a tin cup of bourbon, the bottle resting between them. Fireflies sparked in the tall grass, and the hum of cicadas wove through the air like background music to a memory Clay didn't want to remember. "Nice place," she said. "Quiet." Clay sipped slow. Too quiet sometimes. She nodded, her gaze trailing across the fields. "You grow anything out there?" "Used to. Soy, mostly. Corn before that. Not much lately. Drought's killing everything but the weeds." Silence hung for a beat. Then she asked softer, "Do you live here alone?" Clay took a moment. "Used to be my wife and me. She passed 2 years back, cancer." "I'm sorry." Her voice was gentle. "She liked fireflies," Clay said, not knowing why he was telling her. "Used to call them stars you could catch." The woman smiled at that, leaning back. "That's beautiful." They sat without speaking for a while, bourbon warming their chests, and something like mutual fatigue settling over them. Then she said, almost too casually, "I'm not really from around here, just passing through, I guess." Clay nodded. "Figured that. You don't talk like Crowley folk." "Is that a compliment?" "Depends on how they talk where you're from." She grinned, taking another sip. "Boardrooms, airports, hotel bars. I was born in Detroit, but I haven't stayed in one place longer than a week in years." "Sounds like a hell of a life," he muttered. "More like a hell of a schedule." She leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. "I've been thinking about quitting, or escaping. Not sure which word fits." Clay glanced at her. "You running from something?" She didn't answer right away. Her voice dropped into something quiet. "Trying to remember who I am without a last name." He didn't push, just offered her another splash of bourbon and let the silence speak. And for a little while it did, easy, companionable. A strange peace hung in the air, built not on shared stories but shared stillness. Eventually, the bottle ran low. She stood, brushing off her jeans. "Thank you for trusting me with your truck, for the company." "You heading out?" he asked, standing too. "Not tonight. Car's still dead. Thought I'd sleep in the back seat. I've done worse." Clay tilted his head. "There's a couch inside. Not much, but better than a car seat." She blinked, surprised. "You sure?" "I'm not in the habit of leaving people out in the dark. Besides, I got a deadbolt." That made her laugh. A real one this time. She nodded. "Thanks. I promise I don't snore." He watched her walk inside, her steps lighter than when she arrived. He stayed on the porch a little longer, staring at the fireflies. Stars you could catch. Maybe Anna was still here, just in ways he hadn't learned to notice. He took one last sip of bourbon and followed the stranger into the quiet house. Tomorrow would come with questions, but tonight there was peace. The next morning came with the low rumble of Clay's internal alarm clock, early, steady, shaped by years of sunrise chores and silent coffee. He moved through the kitchen with habitual quiet, frying eggs and toasting bread, with a familiarity that didn't require thought. The smell of butter hitting cast iron filled the house, and just as he poured his first cup of coffee, footsteps padded into the room. She wore the same clothes as yesterday, hair tied up with a piece of twine she must have found. Her eyes were softer without the war paint confidence from the day before. "Morning," she said, voice still groggy. "Eggs?" Clay asked without turning. "I'd kill for coffee first," she said with a grin. He slid her a mug and poured a second helping into his own. Over breakfast, they didn't talk much. She watched the dust dance in the window light, while Clay listened to the low murmur of a tractor in the distance, probably old man Riley, turning his fields again, stubborn as the season. After eating, she stood and stretched. "I'll head into town, get the car towed. Shouldn't take too long." Clay nodded but didn't meet her eyes. Part of him was already bracing for her to disappear. The truck disappeared over the ridge. For the second time that week. This time, it hurt a little less, but it left a deeper hollowness. Clay passed the day the way he always did, mending hoses, checking the shed, knocking dust off old plans that had long since expired. But the quiet pressed harder today, like the house had gotten used to her voice and missed it already. Hours dragged on. The sun crossed its apex. Clay tried not to look at the road every 10 minutes, but he failed. By mid-afternoon, the air hung thick with heat. Cicadas screamed in the trees like they were warning him. Something's not right. Then, right around 4, a sheriff's deputy pulled onto the property. Clay wiped his hands on a rag and met the cruiser near the barn. The deputy was young, polite, not someone Clay recognized. "Afternoon, Mr. Turner," he said. "Mind if I ask a quick question?" "Long as it's quick," Clay replied, eyes narrowing. The deputy held up his notepad. "We're looking for someone traveling through the area. Woman, mid-30s, red hair, driving an Audi. We got a call about a missing person matching that description." Clay's spine tensed. "She's not missing. She borrowed my truck, said her car broke down and she needed to get into town." The deputy jotted that down. "Name?" Clay paused. "Didn't give one." "She leave anything behind? Purse? ID? Just the car?" "It's out by the east fence." The deputy nodded. "Mind if I take a look?" "Be my guest." As the cruiser rolled off toward the fence line, Clay's jaw clenched. Something wasn't adding up. If she was running from something, she hadn't acted like it. Then again, who shows up in an Audi with no last name and sleeps on a stranger's couch like it's nothing? It was nearly sundown when the truck came back, headlights flickering across the drive, followed by the low hum of a motor that had definitely been tuned up. Reese, if that was her real name, climbed out wearing new sunglasses and holding a brown paper bag from the diner. "Did I worry you?" she asked, offering a crooked smile. "You had a sheriff out here asking questions," Clay said flatly. "Said someone matching your description was reported missing." She sighed and pushed her glasses up into her hair. "That's my brother. He tends to overreact." Clay crossed his arms. "That's so." She didn't flinch. "He doesn't like when I go off the radar. Thinks I'll get kidnapped by the common folk or something equally absurd. I told him to stop calling the cops." Clay studied her. She looked tired, but not dishonest. "You keep saying you're trying to remember who you are," he said slowly. "You running from something legal?" "No," she said firmly. "Just personal." They stood there, the truck idling behind her, the sun bleeding red behind the trees. She held out the paper bag. Dinner. Thought it was the least I could do. Clay took it, still watching her with that same quiet, weather-beaten scrutiny. "You got a real name?" he asked. She hesitated, then said, "Reese. Reese Ellington." Something clicked. Ellington. Clay's mouth went dry. "As in Ellington Automotive?" Reese gave a small, tired nod. "Yeah, that one." Clay didn't speak, didn't blink. "I'm not here to sell you anything," she added quickly. "I'm not here for press or promotion or whatever else you're thinking. I just needed out, and your place was the first road I turned down." The old screen door banged once in the wind. "Well," Clay said after a pause, "you sure turned down the wrong damn road." He walked past her and into the house, not slamming the door, just closing it. Firm, final. And Reese stood there in the gravel, the weight of her real name thick in the evening air. Her disguise wasn't a wig or a fake passport. It was forgetting how to be Ellington at all. And now, that was gone. Reese didn't leave. She could have. It would have been easier. Drive back to Crowley, call her assistant, disappear into first class. Lounges and boardrooms where her name held currency instead of suspicion. But something about Clay's quiet disapproval, about the door that closed without slamming, anchored her to that gravel drive like a root growing sideways through stone. She sat on the truck bed, dinner bag unopened beside her, and watched the sun dissolve into twilight. Inside, Clay ate in silence. The burger was cold, the fries limp, but he finished it. Partly because he was hungry, partly because throwing it away would have felt too much like throwing away the whole damn conversation. She lied, he thought, not about who she was, but about what she was doing here. The Ellingtons weren't known for impulsive road trips and truck stop breakdowns. They were the kind of people who bought land by the acre and closed factories by email. And she'd been sitting on his porch like she didn't come from glass towers and chrome conference rooms. By the time Clay stepped back outside, Reese hadn't moved. Her back was to him, but he could see the tension in her shoulders. Like she'd braced herself for a verdict, he stood a few feet away. Why here? She didn't look at him, just stared out across the darkened fields. "Because I didn't want anyone to find me. I saw your truck in the field. Something about it looked honest, like it belonged to someone who wasn't looking to get involved." Clay frowned. "So I'm a convenient hiding place?" "No," she said softly. "You're a reminder that there are still people who give without expecting, people who look you in the eye and ask nothing in return." The words hung between them, heavy and too real. "I didn't lie to hurt you," she added. "I lied because I didn't think someone like you would talk to someone like me if you knew the truth." "That's supposed to be flattery." "No, just fact." Clay sat on the porch step, not looking at her. "My wife would have talked to you. She could find the soul in a stone." Reese finally turned. "You miss her?" "Every day," Clay said. "She's in everything. This porch, that field, that truck you keep running off with." "I'm not running anymore." Clay looked up. "Ain't that the first lie you told me?" Reese smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Maybe, but I'm tired, Clay. Tired of boardrooms, tired of pitches, tired of being treated like a signature instead of a person." "And you think my truck can fix that?" "No," she said. "But I think maybe the way you handed me the keys without asking for anything, that fixed something I didn't even know was broken." A soft wind stirred the wheat stubble. The stars blinked into place. Clay sighed. "You're not the first rich person to come through here pretending. They ain't, but you might be the first one to actually roll their sleeves up." Reese stood, brushing her hands on her jeans. "Then let me keep earning the couch, or the floor if you're still mad." "I ain't mad," Clay muttered. "I'm just trying to figure out what happens when people like you show up and decide." They like the view. She stepped closer. Maybe they stay, maybe they try to do something useful. Useful? He smirked. You know how to patch irrigation lines? Fix a carburetor? Weld a fence post? No, she admitted. But I learn fast, and I make great coffee. Clay gave a dry chuckle. We'll start with that. By morning, Reese was up before Clay, already outside fiddling with the garden hose and pouring feed into rusted troughs, with two curious chickens pecking at her boots. You feeding birds or making friends? Clay called from the porch. Both, she said brightly. Geraldine and Mabel like me. He shook his head, amused despite himself. They like anyone, with cracked corn. The days took on a rhythm after that. Reese stayed in the guest room. She brewed coffee, helped where she could, took notes in a little leather-bound book she never explained. Clay taught her how to tell when a pump was failing just by the change in its hum. She taught him how to balance a budget using spreadsheet. Apps he refused to download, but didn't mind watching her use. They talked slowly, shared stories, piecemeal. Reese admitted she once signed off on a factory closure that laid off 300 people. She still had nightmares about it. Clay told her about the day Anna got her diagnosis, how he'd sat in the waiting room trying to remember how to breathe. They became something strange and tender, not quite friends, not quite strangers, orbiting each other with a quiet honesty neither of them had earned, but both needed. One night, Reese wandered out to the barn, where Clay was working under the hood of a tractor that hadn't run since Easter. I've been thinking, she said, leaning against the doorframe. Your equipment is barely holding together, your overhead's too high, and your yield isn't keeping pace with market rates. Thanks for the pep talk, Clay grunted, wiping grease on his jeans. I meant, maybe there's a way to help, not as Ellington, just as Reese. He looked up at her, wariness in his eyes. Help how? Invest. Partner quietly. I could help get this place modernized. Solar panels, new irrigation, better distribution channels. You wouldn't owe me anything beyond the work itself. Clay stood slowly, the wrench heavy in his hand. You offering to buy me out? No, she said. I'm offering to build something with you. Silence. The kind of silence that wrapped around the rafters and echoed in the cracks of old wood. Anna and I had plans, Clay said at last. Big ones, but we ran out of time. Reese stepped forward. Maybe we pick up where she left off. He studied her for a long time, then nodded once, just once, and in that nod was the beginning of something neither of them could name yet, but both had started to believe in. There are days that pass like pages in a photo album, quiet, sepia-toned, heavy with the weight of what might be blooming. The next week on the farm moved like that. No big declarations, no final decisions, just slow progress and small shifts. Reese learning to back a trailer without hitting the barn. Clay letting her take over his weather log like it wasn't the sacred scripture he'd been keeping since the 90s. They fell into a rhythm, not always speaking, but always present. Reese started taking notes about equipment upgrades between chores. Clay started leaving her little tasks without asking, checking water pressure, refilling seed bins, like some corner of him finally trusted she'd stay long enough to finish them. But change never comes without friction. One morning, Clay came into the kitchen to find Reese on the phone, pacing barefoot in front of the stove. No, I don't need a car flown in. I need you to stop sending things without asking, she said sharply. I told you I'm not stranded. I'm staying. Yes, staying. She paused. No, I haven't lost my mind. I've found it. Clay didn't move. She hadn't noticed him yet, and for a brief moment he watched her, the way her posture shifted when she talked to someone who expected her to be someone else. I'm not coming back next week, she added. Tell the board they can run a meeting without me. For once. Click. Reese turned and froze. Clay leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. Problem, she exhaled, not sheepish exactly, but caught. That was my assistant. She thought I'd been kidnapped again. You tell her you were being held hostage by 2 chickens and a broken irrigation pump. Reese smiled. Something like that. Clay walked to the counter, poured 2 mugs of coffee and set one in front of her. You're burning bridges. I'm not. She paused. I'm just turning the car around. He sat across from her. That means you're planning to stay. I don't know yet, she said, but every day I don't leave feels like a choice. Later that afternoon, the storm came in fast, the kind of sudden summer violence that turns the sky green and drops the temperature by 20 degrees in minutes. Clay had been in the lower field, inspecting the south gate. Reese was up by the barn, trying to organize rusted tools into some sort of system. When the sky cracked open with its first warning boom, she looked up from the oil-stained box she was sorting and saw Clay running, fast, all muscle and memory, toward the livestock pens. She didn't hesitate. Rain hit the earth like fists, cold and furious. Together they scrambled to get the animals under cover. Clay was shouting over the wind, pulling tarps, tying gates, barking orders like Reese was one of his field hands. She followed every word, soaked to the bone but locked in. A sheet of lightning lit up the ridge, and for a moment the whole world felt like it cracked in half. After the last animal was penned and the gates secured, Clay grabbed Reese by the elbow and pulled her into the barn, slamming the doors shut behind them. They stood there, panting, dripping. Thunder shook the walls. Reese burst into laughter. That was insane. Clay, hands on his knees, let out a breathless chuckle. You kept up. You said, tie the east gate. And I did it. I didn't even know we had an east gate until today. You'll make a half-decent farmhand yet. She stepped closer. You're bleeding, she said, reaching for his arm. He looked down. Sure enough, a scratch from a wire fence, shallow but streaked with blood. Don't fuss, he said. But she was already pulling a bandana from her back pocket, dabbing at it carefully. Her fingers were steady. Too steady. I was scared, she said softly. He looked up. Of the storm? No. That I'd mess up, that I'd slow you down, that I'd make things worse. You didn't. She met his eyes. I didn't want you to think I couldn't handle it. I don't, he said. You handled it just fine. The barn went quiet again, save for the drumbeat of rain on the roof. You're not like the people I've known, she said, and you're not like the people I try to avoid. They both laughed, but it was a soft sound. Real. The storm passed before sunset, leaving behind the smell of wet earth and ozone. They walked the fence lines together, checking for damage. Reese held a flashlight while Clay reset a post. The land felt reborn, cleaner somehow. At the far edge of the property, where the fields touched the woods, Reese stopped and looked out. The sky had cleared, revealing stars so bright it felt like they were stitched into the fabric of the night. She breathed in deep. You ever just look out here and think, this is it? This is enough? Clay didn't answer right away. He stared into the same stars, listening to the insects return to their song. I used to, he said finally. When Anna was alive, when we had the whole place mapped out in dreams and scratched down notebooks. Then she got sick. And after that, I guess I stopped thinking about enough. I just started trying to survive. Reese turned toward him. Do you think you could ever dream again? He looked at her, not just at her, but into her, like he was searching for something behind. Her eyes. Maybe, he said, but not alone. That night, Reese couldn't sleep. She stood by the window in her room, watching the moon rise over the barn, Clay's shadow moving faintly across the yard as he double-checked the gate locks. She felt the pull, stronger than any boardroom table or brand strategy, not just toward Clay, but toward the life he represented. One where effort mattered more than polish, where days were earned instead of scheduled. She opened her journal and wrote only 2 words, stay, build. Below it, in parentheses, not because I ran, because I chose. And in that moment, the decision began to take root, quietly, fiercely, like a seed pushing through stone. 3 days after the storm, Clay's tractor gave out for good. It sputtered twice while he was cutting across the north pasture, then let out a final wheezing cough like a dying animal. When Reese reached him, the hood was up. His head was buried inside it, and his shoulders were locked in that grim stillness she was beginning to recognize as quiet panic. "It's not the fuel line," he muttered. "Not the carburetor either. I rebuilt it last winter." Reese circled the machine, her eyes scanning the battered frame. "You've had this thing since when?" "Reagan?" "Before him. Anna's father. Gave it to us as a wedding gift. Old girl was built to last, but even metal has its limits." She crouched, touching the cracked casing near the transmission. "Clay, this isn't just wear and tear. This thing's been patched to death." He didn't answer. She looked up. "We can't just keep throwing duct tape on everything. If we're going to save this place, we need new equipment, real investment." He stood, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. "I don't take handouts." "It wouldn't be one." "Then what would it be?" She hesitated. "A partnership, like I said before." Clay's jaw tightened. "I don't like owing people, Reese, especially not people who can walk away. With a phone call. I've been here for weeks, and you've got the kind of last name that means you can vanish in a blink and go back to glass towers and boardrooms." She stood, voice low. "I don't want the towers anymore. You think I came here to play farm girl? I've been clawing through my life with a smile on my face and a noose around my neck. This," she gestured around them, "this is the first place I've ever breathed without apologizing for it." Clay looked at her, emotion flickering behind the hardness in his eyes. "I just don't want to lose the only damn thing I've got left because I made a deal I didn't understand." "You won't." A silence stretched, thick but not sharp. Finally he spoke. "If we're partners, we both bleed for it. No saving me, no taking over. We build together, or not at all." Reese nodded. "Agreed." The next morning, Clay found her in the kitchen with his ledgers spread out across the table like war maps. She looked up. "You've been running this place off prayer and spite." "Don't forget habit," he said, pouring himself coffee. She smiled. "I drafted a list. Equipment needs, structural repairs, and a phased plan for upgrades over the next year. I also talked to a local co-op about distributing directly. We cut the middlemen, we make twice as much per acre." Clay took the paper she held out, squinting at it like it was written in another language. It kind of was, but he read it carefully. Finally, he nodded. "It's solid. Then we start today. I'll finance the first wave. In return, I want a seat at the table. Every decision, every challenge, full transparency." "Then I guess you'd better get some work boots that aren't white." She glanced at her scuffed designer sneakers. These were $600. "They're $15 now," he deadpanned. "Mud depreciates fast." The next 2 weeks felt like the ground was shifting beneath them, but this time in a way that felt like growth, not collapse. Reese called in a few quiet favors, not from Ellington, but from old connections she trusted. A refurbished John Deere arrived on a flatbed. Clay was visibly emotional, but refused to say so. Instead, he ran his hand along the hood and muttered, "She's green, that's a start." A local contractor came out to quote the repairs on the barn roof. Reese stood beside Clay, clipboard in hand, asking questions he hadn't thought of. She didn't take over, she stood beside, and that made all the difference. Their partnership deepened, not just in work, but in presence. One night, Reese found Clay in the old tool shed, hunched over a wooden workbench, sketching something on yellowed paper. "What's that?" she asked. He looked up, startled, then turned the page so she could see. A layout, new fencing, crop rotation plans, a chicken. "Run!" "It was Anna's idea," he said. "We drew it up before she got sick, never had the time or money to start." Reese studied it. "Then let's build it. Not because it was hers, but because it's good." He smiled faintly. "You're not what I expected." She tilted her head. "What did you expect?" "A tourist, one of those people who thinks buying a flannel shirt means they know hardship." She laughed. "I've got blisters in places I didn't know could blister." Welcome to farming. She leaned against the workbench. You know, I'm not doing this just for you. This isn't charity. I know, he said, that's why it works, but not everyone saw it that way. One afternoon, a truck Clay didn't recognize pulled up the drive. A sleek silver SUV with tinted windows and a license plate frame that read LUXC. Reese froze on the porch when she saw it, her jaw clenched. The door opened. Out stepped a man in a designer suit, tailored within an inch of its life. Reese, he said flatly, we need to talk. Clay stepped down beside her. Friend of yours? Worse, she muttered. Board rep. The man didn't smile. You've missed 3 strategy sessions. Stockholders are asking questions. You left your division leaderless and unreachable. Reese crossed her arms. I told you I'm stepping away. That's not how this works. You don't get to go rogue. You're an Ellington. You carry the brand. Clay stepped forward, voice calm but firm. She carries a lot more than that now. The man looked him over with thinly veiled disdain. And you are? Her partner, Clay said simply. The man turned back to Reese. You've got 48 hours. Either come back or the board moves without you. And trust me, you won't like what they do to your name. Reese didn't flinch. Then maybe it's time they stopped hiding behind mine. The SUV peeled out, leaving behind the smell of rubber and cheap threat. Clay looked at her. You okay? She nodded, but her hands trembled. I knew it would come to this, she whispered. I just didn't expect it to sting so much. Clay didn't say anything. He just took her hand, calloused and cut from weeks of real work, and held it in silence. The fight had just begun, but now she wouldn't face it alone. The next morning, Reese woke to the scent of cinnamon and rain-soaked wood. Clay had started baking again, something he hadn't done in years. The kitchen was filled with warmth, the kind that couldn't be bottled or sold. She stepped in quietly, watching him sprinkle sugar over a tray of rolls before slipping them into the old oven with the gentleness of a man handling memory. You bake now? She asked, voice still gravelly with sleep. Clay glanced over his shoulder, brushing flour off his hands. Only when I'm thinking too loud helps quiet it down. Reese sat at the table, pulling her sweater closer. I barely slept. Because of him? She nodded. He was right in a way. About the company, the brand, my name. I spent so long building something I thought I was proud of. Now I look at it and see control, pressure, a version of me I can't carry anymore. Clay poured coffee into her mug, then sat across from her. You've still got choices, but you're the one who has to live with whichever one you make. I'm not going back, she said, more to herself than to him, but I have to do it on my terms. That means ending it properly. By afternoon, she was back in her room with her laptop open and a document titled Ellington Motors, Resignation, and Transition Memo. She stared at the blinking cursor like it was daring her. This wasn't just a job she was walking away from, it was a dynasty. Her great-grandfather's name was on the first dealership. Her father's shadow loomed over. Every board meeting, her own initials were stamped into the design of 3 flagship models. But that wasn't her anymore. Clay passed the doorway once, saw her staring blankly at the screen, and didn't interrupt. He just left a slice of warm cinnamon roll beside her keyboard and kept moving. She smiled softly, then she started typing. It took her 5 hours. When she was done, she emailed the document to her assistant and copied every board member. Then she shut the laptop and walked outside, barefoot. The sky was clear, and the air smelled like hope. She found Clay near the barn, replacing slats. In the old fence, his shirt was damp with sweat, his hands blackened from the wood stain. I did it, she said. He didn't ask what, he just set down the hammer and looked at her. How does it feel? She thought for a second. Like I just took a breath I've been holding for 10 years. Clay walked over, his eyes searching. Hers. Then let's build something you don't want to run from. The days that followed were some of the best they'd shared. There was a lightness between them now, like something heavy had been set down. Reese started sketching out an idea for an event, an open farm day for the community, food stalls, hay rides, a live auction of fresh produce. Clay had been skeptical at first. "We're not a theme park, but we're also not a secret," she countered. "This land has more than one kind of value." She called it harvest revival. He called it madness, but he helped her anyway. Flyers went up in town. The local radio station even did a short feature when Reese called in and charmed them with a blend of down-home grit and luxury roots, the novelty of an Ellington heiress turning dirt under her fingernails. It was good press. But Reese wasn't chasing optics anymore. She just wanted people to come, to see the land, to feel something real. The morning of the event, the sun broke through the clouds like a benediction. Tables were lined with fresh vegetables, baked goods, handmade crafts from nearby artisans. Kids ran through the open pastures, their laughter cutting through the crisp air like birdsong. Local musicians played near the barn, while older folks drank cider and shared stories. And everywhere Reese looked, Clay, helping with the tractor rides, explaining the layout of the irrigation system to a curious teenager, flirting shamelessly with the woman who ran the peach stand and was clearly older than his mother. Reese laughed out loud when she saw it. But then their eyes met across the crowd, and something deeper passed between them. He made his way to her slowly. She was standing near the apple tasting station, clipboard in hand, but he plucked it away and set it on a bale of hay. "You're allowed to stop working and enjoy what you built," he said. "I don't know how to do that. I can teach you." She let him pull her into a slow walk. The crowd blurred behind them. The music faded. "I didn't expect it to work," she admitted. "This day, this farm, us." Clay stopped, turned to face her. "I didn't expect you to stay," he said. "But you did. I didn't expect you to let me in. I didn't want to, but I did." They stood there, a foot apart, the breeze brushing Reese's hair into her face. Clay reached up and tucked it behind her ear. "You make things grow again," he whispered. She didn't answer. She just leaned in and kissed him, slow, certain, like the decision had already been made somewhere in her bones, long before this moment ever arrived. When they pulled apart, neither smiled. They just looked at each other, like they were memorizing the feeling. That night, after everyone had gone and the fields were littered with footprints and cider cups, Reese and Clay sat on the porch with 2 mugs of leftover apple cider and a blanket between them. She rested her head on his shoulder. "We could do more events like this," she said. "Workshops, classes, even host school trips. You don't have to be just a farmer. You could be a teacher, a mentor." "You're turning me into a brand," he teased. "No, I'm giving you a platform. There's a difference." He looked out across the fields. "You really think this is sustainable?" "I think anything worth building takes time and heart." Clay was quiet a moment. "Anna used to talk about making this land more than just a livelihood, said it should be a haven, a place people remember even if they're only passing through." Reese closed her eyes. "Then let's finish what she started." He pulled the blanket tighter around their shoulders and rested his chin on her head. They didn't speak again that night. They didn't need to. The air around them had already said enough. A week passed after harvest revival, and the land settled into a quieter rhythm, as if the soil itself had exhaled. The buzz of tractors, the soft murmur of wind through the fields, the occasional cackle of chickens, they all formed a kind of symphony Reese was starting to memorize. She found herself waking before dawn without an alarm, slipping into her worn jeans and heading out with Clay without needing to speak. And in that silence, something began to root between them. Not just affection, trust. One morning, they were stacking hay in the back barn, hands blistered and shirts clinging to their backs, when Clay suddenly stopped. He wiped his forehead with his sleeve. "You ever think about staying?" Reese blinked. I am staying. I mean longer than a season. Longer than the next harvest. I mean roots, here. It was the kind of question you couldn't answer casually. She took a breath. Yes, I've thought about it. Every day, actually. Clay didn't smile, but something in his eyes softened. Me too. They didn't need to talk about it more than that. The words had already been spoken, but not everything was blooming. One afternoon, while checking emails from the co-op office downtown, Reese's laptop dinged with a message from her assistant. It was short, clipped, and cold. Subject: urgent legal notice attached. Body: they're pushing it through. You need to read this. Attached was a PDF. The title hit like a slap. Formal motion to remove Reese Ellington from Ellington Motors Executive Trust and Board. Her breath caught in her chest. She read it again, slower this time, as if reading it wrong would make it different. The language was brutal: negligent withdrawal, conflict of interest, breach of fiduciary responsibility. And at the bottom, a list of names, people she had mentored, grown with, trusted. They were cutting her out, completely. She closed the laptop, hands trembling. The barn door creaked open. Clay stood there, wiping grease from his palms with a rag. I was thinking we could haul... He stopped when he saw her face. What happened? She handed him the laptop without a word. He read it, slowly, his jaw clenched tighter with each line. Then he set it on the table beside her. You gonna fight it? He asked. She looked up. I already let it go, but I didn't think they'd come for my name too. Clay sat beside her. You are not your name. You're what you do with it. She stared ahead, eyes glassy. They want to erase me. Pretend I never shaped any of it. I gave years to that company. I bled for it. And now you're building something else, Clay said. Something they can't touch. Her voice cracked. But it still hurts. I know. That night, she went for a walk alone. The moon was high, the stars scattered like breadcrumbs across a black velvet sky. She ended up near the north field, the one Clay had replanted just weeks ago. The seedlings were starting to push through, delicate and green. She knelt down, running a hand over the edge of a sprout. This was what she'd traded for boardrooms and private jets, fragile new life, depending on patience and sunlight. She stayed there for an hour until her tears dried and her spine ached from crouching. Then she stood and walked back with dirt on her knees and something steadier in her chest. The next day, she and Clay worked without talking about the letter. Instead, they fixed a gate that kept swinging in the wind. He taught her how to check the oil on the new tractor. She showed him how to build a basic spreadsheet for crop inventory. It was partnership in its purest form. Shared labor, shared winds, shared silence. And yet there was a new undercurrent to their days now. That night, after dinner, Clay pulled out a box from under his bed. I wasn't going to show you this, but I think maybe it's time. He handed it to her and stepped back. Inside were photos of Anna, yes, but also of the farm's early years. Clay smiling beside a calf, him and Anna painting the barn red. A picnic under the big elm tree with a checkered blanket and lemonade jars. Reese ran her fingers over them. She was beautiful, she said. Inside and out, Clay replied. She believed in things I couldn't see, dreams I thought were too soft for a man like me. Reese looked up. And now, I think you helped me see what she saw. There was a pause, not awkward, just full. Reese whispered, "Thank you for showing me this." Clay nodded. "Thank you for not running when it got hard." A week later, a man from a regional agricultural nonprofit stopped by. He'd heard about the harvest revival, about the land restoration, about Reese's new crop distribution plan. "We're launching a spotlight program," he explained, "a grant and a mentorship initiative for farms rebuilding after loss. We want you two as a model site." Reese blinked. "Why us?" "Because you're not just reviving a farm. You're reviving a way of life." They said yes. That night, Clay poured 2 glasses of bourbon and handed one to Reese. To new beginnings, he said. To endings that finally make sense, she replied. They clinked glasses, and just before the stars took the sky again, he pulled her. Close, their foreheads pressed together in the quiet. Whatever happens next, he said, I'm glad you stopped for gas that day. Reese smiled. Me too, Clay, me too. 2 months passed, and for once in her life, time didn't feel like a deadline. Reese found herself breathing deeper, sleeping better, even laughing the way she used to before boardrooms and quarterly. Earnings reports had become the air she breathed. Her body still remembered stress, but her heart, slowly, was learning peace. The days turned gold and copper as autumn arrived in full. The trees blushed deeper each morning, and the smell of firewood and fallen leaves drifted through the air like nostalgia. Even Clay, who still refused to admit he liked pumpkin anything, started leaving the house with cinnamon coffee in hand, courtesy of Reese, who made a habit of spoiling him in little persistent ways. But beneath the calm, something began to stir again. It started when a sleek black car rolled down the gravel drive one afternoon, tires crackling like thunder across the quiet fields. Clay was in the shed, Reese by the chicken coop. She squinted at the vehicle as it parked, a city car, corporate polished, far too clean for these roads. Her stomach tightened. The door opened. A woman stepped out, tall and poised, dressed in a crisp pantsuit that didn't belong within 5 miles of a hay bale. Aunt Helena, Reese said under her breath. Helena Ellington wasn't just family. She was power. The oldest of the Ellington siblings, she'd never married, never softened. She chaired 3 boards, owned 2 vineyards, and once negotiated a hostile merger in heels high enough to be considered weapons. Reese approached carefully. Didn't expect to see you here, she said. Helena looked around the farm, her lips pressing into a tight line. You look like your mother when she gave up modeling to raise chickens. It didn't end well for her either. Reese folded her arms. Is this a family visit or a warning? Both. She handed Reese a manila envelope. Inside were papers, dense, aggressive legal language stamped with Ellington Motors' gold seal. You're being offered a settlement, Helena said. Full divestment. You sign, and your name is wiped clean from the family holdings. No more lawsuits, no more threats. Reese's fingers tightened around the edges. And if I don't, you'll be litigated into exhaustion, and you'll lose. There was no malice in her voice, just cold certainty, the kind that came from decades of knowing how to win. Clay found her later, sitting in the hayloft, legs swinging off the edge, envelope beside her like a loaded gun. She didn't look at him when he sat down beside her. They want me gone, not just out, but erased. He stayed quiet. They're afraid. Not of me, but of what it means if I walk away and thrive, if I prove there's life outside of the machine. Then prove it, he said. Show them they don't own your worth. Reese looked at him, eyes shining with restrained fury. But it's not just business anymore, Clay. It's my name, my history. They're threatening to take away the last piece of my family I still had. Clay leaned forward, elbows on knees. You still have a family, he said softly. It just doesn't look like it used to. She didn't sign. Instead, she sent back the envelope with a handwritten note inside. You can keep the company. I'll keep my soul. 2 days later, Helena returned. But this time, she came alone. Without contracts or threats, just a scarf around her shoulders and an unreadable look in her eyes. I was furious, she said, standing in the garden where Reese was kneeling in the dirt. But now, I'm curious. Reese wiped her hands and stood. About what? About what it is you think you're building here. A life, Reese answered. One that's mine. Helena watched her for a long moment. Then, to Reese's surprise, she walked over to the wooden bench under the fig tree and sat. I started that company with your father. Before the lawyers. Before the name meant anything. We had nothing but borrowed money and a dream. somewhere along the way, the dream changed. Became heavier. Reese knelt again, tugging weeds with slow precision. "I don't want to be heavy anymore," she said. "I want to feel like myself." Helena looked around at the rows of kale and tomatoes, the bee boxes, the irrigation lines. "And do you?" Reese nodded. "More every day." Helena stood and brushed off her slacks. "Then I hope you hold on to it." And with that, she walked away for the last time. That night, Reese sat on the porch alone, a blanket around her shoulders and a notebook in her lap. She'd started keeping a journal again. Not a digital one. Pen to paper, every page messy and real. Thoughts spilled across the lines like roots, tangled and reaching. Clay joined her after dark, handing her a mug of hot cider. "I saw her car leave," he said. "She asked me if I felt like myself again. And I told her the truth." He leaned against the railing. "You ever miss it, that world?" Reese sipped her cider, thought about the heels and glass offices, the applause after speeches, the weight of 1,000 unsaid expectations. "I miss the part of me that thought that world would love me back." Clay sat beside her, pulling the blanket across both their laps. "It's not easy," he said, "walking away from the thing you thought would save you." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "It's easier with you." He kissed the top of her head. Same. Weeks passed, and slowly the farm began to feel less like escape and more like home. Reese designed new labels for their produce, sketched out logos with hand-drawn fonts. "We'll call it Second Soil," she said one morning, "because sometimes you have to plant in a new place to grow." Clay grinned. "You're still branding everything, huh?" "Can't help it." And he didn't want her to, because this was the version of Reese that bloomed without trying. She was radiant when she was caked in mud and laughing through a sunburn. She was unstoppable when planning the new grant applications or mentoring the neighboring farm's daughter in her first greenhouse project. She wasn't running from her past anymore. She was growing from it. And Clay, he found himself doing the same. He smiled more, called his sister back, even started writing down the farming techniques he used, just in case someone else might need them one day. Love, when it's real, has a way of planting things you never expected to harvest. And on that land, between rows of stubborn crops and the ghosts of what once was, something sacred took root. Something permanent. The first. Frost arrived quietly. One morning, Reese stepped out onto the porch and saw the fields dusted with silver, like the earth had exhaled in glitter. The air was sharper, crisper. Even the chickens seemed to cluck with more urgency, as if they too knew time was shifting. Clay joined her, thermos in hand, gazing out over the land he'd lived on his entire life. "Winter's early," he said. Reese nodded. "But we're ready." And they were. The root cellar was packed. Firewood was stacked neat and tall beside the house. The late crops had been harvested, and the greenhouse was already humming with trays of greens under soft amber light. Still, the frost wasn't just outside. It crept into Clay's joints, into Reese's thoughts, into moments that went just a little too quiet. Because even in this calm, the weight of change pressed against them. One evening, while organizing receipts for their small batch produce shipments, Reese caught sight of her old laptop, the one with the Ellington Motors seal still faintly visible where her sticker had started to peel. She hadn't touched it in weeks, and yet something inside her told her to open it. It booted up slowly, the fan louder than she remembered. Notifications lit up the screen like a city skyline. Dozens of missed emails, news alerts, and one message labeled simply, "Forgive me, Dad." Her breath caught. She hadn't heard from her father since the settlement. Not a call, not a message, not a word. Hands trembling, she clicked it. The message was brief, just a video file. She clicked play. Her father sat at a desk, the camera shaky, his eyes tired. "I know I'm the last person you want to hear from," he began, "but I've watched you. Not through lawyers, not through press. Just You, on that farm, with those people, building. Something with your hands, he paused. I was wrong about what strength is, about what legacy means. Reese couldn't breathe. You are the best of this family, and if you never speak to me again, I'll understand. But I wanted to say it while I still could. The video ended. She sat frozen, the silence pressing into her chest. And then, like a wave breaking, she sobbed. Not for the words, not even for the pain, but for the years lost in between. Clay found her like that, sitting in the office with the lights off, tears streaking her cheeks. He didn't ask, he didn't need to. He just knelt beside her, wrapped his arms around her waist, and held her until her body stopped shaking. Then he whispered, "You don't have to carry this alone." The next morning, Reese did something unexpected. She emailed her father back. Not a long message, just a line, "Come see it if you really mean it." She didn't expect a reply, but the very act of sending it felt like thawing ice. A week later, a black SUV pulled up the same gravel path where Reese had once rolled in, with a broken heart and a borrowed past. Clay stood near the barn, watching as a man stepped out, older than she remembered, grayer, thinner, but unmistakably her father. He looked around, taking in the layout, the rows of crops, the windmill Clay had fixed with her last spring. And then he saw her. He didn't speak. Neither did she. Not at first. Then he said, "You built this?" Reese nodded. With him, with the land, with help. He stepped forward slowly. "You look like your mother." That's what Aunt Helena said. He smiled faintly. She was always right about that. They stood in silence again. Finally, Reese gestured toward the porch. "Cider?" He nodded. They sat on the steps, sipping from mismatched mugs, the cold air wrapping around them gently. "I didn't know how to raise someone like you," he said. "You always thought so big. I just wanted to protect you, and I think I ended up shrinking you instead." She swallowed hard. "You could have just said that." "I didn't know how." They sat for a long time, letting the air carry away the things they didn't say. And then, because the earth turns no matter what, Clay opened the barn door and called for Reese to help him with a broken axle. She stood. Her father stood too. Can I see the rest of it?" he asked. She nodded, and side by side, they walked the land. That night, Clay lit a fire in the outdoor pit and grilled pork chops over open flame. Reese, her father, and Clay sat under wool blankets, the stars above them shimmering like scattered hope. Her father told stories, ones about her childhood she'd forgotten, ones about her mother she'd never heard. And for the first time in her adult life, she listened to him not as the CEO of Ellington Motors, but as a man, flawed, aging, and finally, trying. When he left the next morning, he handed her a small envelope. "Not money," he said quickly. "Just something I thought you should have." Inside was an old photo, Reese as a toddler, sitting in a tiny plastic truck in the Ellington Motors showroom, a bow in her hair, and her father kneeling beside her, smiling. On the back, in faint ink, it read, "Up your next driver." Reese looked up. "You still are," he said, "just not in the direction I expected." She hugged him, not out of forgiveness, not out of forgetting, but because sometimes we get to start again. As the truck drove away, Clay came to her side. "You okay?" She nodded. "I think so." And then she smiled. "I think we're ready." "For what?" "For more." Clay raised a brow. "More what?" She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a sketch, a rough outline of a new barn extension, plans for an outdoor classroom, composting workshop space, and a corner for farm-to-table dinners hosted once a month. "We've got people watching now." The grant opened a door. "My name might still open a few more," he grinned. "You're still a businesswoman, and you're still the farmer who let a stranger borrow his truck." They laughed. And then, under the cold blue sky, They kissed, slow and steady like a promise unfolding. Snow came before the last leaves could finish falling. It didn't announce itself with flurries or a gentle dusting. It arrived full force, blanketing the farm in white, silencing the fields and slowing everything down. The world turned softer, quieter, as if asking everyone to pause and take stock. Inside the farmhouse, Reese stood at the window with a mug of tea, her breath fogging the glass. Outside, Clay trudged through knee-high snow to check the generator, bundled in every layer he owned. And even though her fingers were chilled from the draft sneaking in through the windows, Reese felt warm in a way that had nothing to do with heat. This was their first winter together, not just surviving it, but owning it. They settled into a rhythm that only winter could create. Mornings were slow, Reese reading grant submissions at the kitchen table while Clay fed the animals, muttering soft apologies to the grumpy goats. The afternoons were spent fixing small things that never got attention in harvest season. Evenings, though, were sacred. They cooked together, read out loud, danced in the kitchen to old records when the power flickered but never failed, laughed about who used more hot water, learned that love sometimes meant shoveling snow before sunrise without being asked. But still, as the season deepened, so did the silence. Not between them, but around them. The kind of quiet that sneaks into your mind and makes you ask, is this really it? Can this last? One night, Reese lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. Snow tapped against the window like restless thoughts. She nudged Clay, whispering, "You asleep?" A soft grunt. She turned toward him. "Do you ever wonder if you're dreaming this?" He opened one eye. "Only when I wake up and you're still here," she smiled. "I mean it. We built something out of nothing." "Doesn't that scare you?" He rolled onto his back, staring up with her. "Sometimes, but it's the good kind of scary. What if the truck had never broken down? What if I'd never knocked on your door?" He took her hand. "Then I'd still be out there thinking I'd already seen the best of my life, and you'd be in a boardroom thinking you were chasing yours." They stayed like that for a long time, fingers woven, the silence between them full of unspoken gratitude. A week later, Clay got a call from the neighboring farm. Their delivery truck had slid into a ditch and their livestock feed was stuck 2 towns over. Without a second thought, Clay fired up the old Ford. "I'll go with you," Reese said, zipping up her coat. He raised a brow. "You hate that truck in snow." "I love that truck," she corrected. "It saved my life." And so they went, slipping. Down the road, windshield wipers groaning, the heater rattling like an old man's cough. They picked up the feed, dropped it at the neighboring barn, and as they drove home, the snow fell harder. On a hill outside town, the truck started to slide. Clay steered into it, calm, but the back tires lost traction, and the whole vehicle spun once, twice, then stopped with a soft crunch against a snowbank. They sat in stunned silence, heartbeats loud. Reese blinked. "We okay?" Clay nodded. "Yeah, just stuck." They looked at each other and then burst out laughing. They waited for a tow, wrapped in a blanket Clay kept behind the seat for emergencies. Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside, Reese pressed her forehead to the glass. "It's funny, isn't it, that this truck started everything?" Clay looked over. "Started?" She turned toward him, serious now. "I think I'm ready." He tilted his head. "For what?" "For the next thing." He said nothing, just stared at her like he already knew where this was going, but didn't dare hope it. "I want to stay," she whispered. "Not just through winter, not just until the crops come in. I want this, all of it. You, the mud, the chickens, the frostbitten toes. I want to build a life where the first truck I ever truly owned wasn't made of chrome and custom leather, but rust and kindness." Clay blinked once, then again, and then he reached into the glove box and pulled out a tiny box wrapped in burlap string. Reese stared. You. What? He held it out, shrugging. I've had it for a month. Been waiting for the right weather. She laughed, a startled, tearful kind of laugh, and took the box. Inside was a ring, not flashy, not Ellington. A thin band of hammered gold, a single moonstone set in the center like frozen light. Clay cleared his throat. I didn't know if you'd want something official, but if you do, I'd like to. Be yours. Reese didn't answer. She kissed him. They got home an hour later, hands still tangled, cheeks flushed from the cold and the proposal. The porch light flickered on as they climbed the steps, the warm glow spilling over their boots like welcome. Inside, Reese pulled off her coat and turned to face Clay. Let's build everything. Everything? Everything. A workshop, a kitchen garden, a line of preserves with my mother's name on it, maybe even... She stopped. Clay waited. Maybe even a family. He stepped forward, arms sliding around her waist. You sure? She nodded. I used to think power was owning the world. But now I know it's being known by someone and still being loved. The next morning the sun returned, and with it, a sense of beginning. They announced the engagement at breakfast with the local co-op volunteers. There were cheers, toasts, with hot cocoa, and more than one person whispering, finally, the story of the girl in the broken truck had already become legend. Now they were writing the sequel, together. Spring announced itself not with flowers, but with thaw. The key, kind of thaw that turns fields to mud and rivers into roaring declarations. The air smelled of promise, of earth waking up, of all the things buried deep pushing their way toward the sun. And Reese woke with it. She opened the windows that first morning, breathing in deeply as birdsong returned to the world. She wasn't the same woman who had arrived at the farm months ago, with a suitcase full of guilt and a last name too heavy to carry. Now she wore boots worn down at the heel, a sun hat with twine stitched into the brim, and dirt under her fingernails that she refused to scrub out because it meant something. Clay was already outside, knees deep in compost, muttering about acidity levels and soil rotation. He looked up when she stepped off the porch. You've got the smile again, he said. What smile? The one you had the first time you saw a tomato ripen on the vine. She laughed and kissed him quickly, then ran her hand along the rim of her old truck, the one Clay had rebuilt for her with spare parts and patience. It had a new coat of paint now, sunflower yellow, and the words Second Chance Farms hand-lettered on the side. Not flashy, not perfect, but fully theirs. That week, they hosted their first community workshop. It was Reese's idea, a day of dirt, open to anyone curious about sustainable living. They expected 10 people. 30 showed up. Some came with questions, others with notebooks, and a few just needed the company. Reese led the morning session on composting techniques, her voice confident, her hands moving with practiced assurance. Clay handled the soil testing and garden prep station, cracking dry jokes that had the teenagers giggling. When it ended, the crowd lingered, asking about future events, about the preserves Reese had hinted at launching, about whether they could help with anything at all. Reese watched them go, her chest full. Later, as they washed dishes together, in the farmhouse kitchen, she whispered, I think we're building more than a farm. Clay dried a mug. Feels like a movement. A few days later, a letter arrived, not an email. A letter on Ellington Motors' letterhead. It was from Reese's cousin, the one who had sided with her father during the boardroom wars and hadn't spoken to her since. Reese held it in her hands for a long time before opening it. Inside, the note was brief. You were right, I want in. And clipped to the back, a check. Not a bribe. A donation, large enough to fund a greenhouse expansion, a cold storage unit, and 6 months of local school visits to the farm. Clay found her staring at it in the barn. She handed it over wordlessly. He read it, raised a brow, then smiled. You're contagious, he said. Spring deepened. The wedding was planned quietly, just a gathering under the cottonwood tree behind the barn, friends and neighbors bringing food instead of gifts, and Clay's great-aunt knitting the rings into a strand of wildflowers. But 2 nights before the ceremony, Clay came into the house looking uneasy. Reese was curled up with the cat on her lap, jotting notes for the next workshop. Clay cleared his throat. "I need to ask you something." She sat up. "Okay." He shifted from foot to foot, then pulled something out of his pocket. It was small, weathered, familiar. The keys to the original truck, the one Reese had driven that first day. The one that had carried her out of the wreckage of her old life and into his. "I kept it," he said. "Didn't tell you. Figured it was your story to finish." She stared at the keys, her throat tightening. He stepped closer. "You want it back, or should we give it to someone else who's stuck?" Her eyes filled. "You want to pass it on?" He nodded. "It got you here. Maybe it can do it again for someone else." She reached out and took the keys, held them tight. "Yeah," she whispered. "Let's make it a tradition." The morning of the wedding, the sky was wide and clear, the kind of blue that looks painted. Guests gathered on hay bales draped in quilts, music playing softly from an old speaker hidden in a milk crate. Reese wore a dress the color of oat milk, simple and soft, with a wreath of rosemary and lavender in her hair. Clay wore suspenders and a crooked grin, and looked like every dream she never knew she had. They said their vows under the tree. Reese's voice cracked halfway through, and Clay just nodded, like he'd heard it all in her silence already. When they kissed, the wind picked up, lifting petals into the air like confetti. Later, they danced barefoot in the field, laughter echoing. Over the hills, and somewhere in the distance, the old yellow truck sat beneath a banner made of scrap cloth and old seed packets. The words stitched into it read, "Every story needs a first mile." That night, Reese and Clay sat on the porch, wrapped in a quilt, watching fireflies spark in the dark. "No honeymoon?" Clay teased. "This is the honeymoon," Reese said, resting her head on his shoulder. "Think we'll ever leave the farm?" "Maybe. For a weekend. For something that matters." She paused. "But I've been running all my life, Clay. Clay. I don't want to anymore. I want to plant things and watch them grow." He kissed her temple. "We're not just planting crops anymore." She smiled sleepily. "I know." And the stars above blinked down like approval. The first summer of their marriage rolled in like golden syrup, thick, sweet, and full of sun. The farm bloomed like it had been waiting for this exact moment. Rows of kale, wild strawberries, and vibrant squash turned the earth into a patchwork of life. The chickens strutted like royalty, the goats got into everything, and the bees, newly installed in 2 hives Reese had painted herself, buzzed contentedly. Reese woke each morning before the sun, not because she had to, but because she wanted to walk barefoot through dew-damp fields, to feel the pulse of something bigger than herself. She hadn't realized just how deeply she'd craved belonging until now. Now every sunrise felt like a quiet yes. Clay had built her a writing shed out behind the old barn. Not much, just a few reclaimed boards, a window with a cracked pane, and a desk facing the trees. But she filled it with pages and purpose. Her hands, once used to signing contracts and closing deals, now drafted articles on regenerative farming and micro-business co-ops. One of her essays, "What Grows When You Let Go," got picked up by a regional publication, then a national one. And just like that, her past life started knocking again. But this time, it wasn't asking her to come back. It was asking her to lead. One afternoon, a film crew arrived. They'd read her essay and wanted to do a short piece on the heiress-turned-farmer. Reese was hesitant, but Clay, ever the steady one, said, "Let them see the real you, not the magazine version." So, they did. Cameras followed her as she harvested carrots and explained soil pH to kids. They caught her wiping sweat from her brow, laughing with Clay as a goat tried to eat his hat, and kneeling in the dirt beside a 12-year-old who asked quietly if girls could be farmers too. That clip went viral. Within a week, thousands of messages flooded in, questions, gratitude, invitations. Reese sat on the porch, blinking at the screen. "This isn't just about us anymore," she whispered. Clay nodded. "Didn't I tell you? It's a movement." They were invited to speak at a sustainability conference in Denver. Reese hesitated. The farm needed them. The baby tomatoes were due to ripen, but Clay insisted. So they packed up, left the animals in the care of a very enthusiastic neighbor named Junie, and drove to the city. It was the first time Reese had been back in a skyline in almost a year. The buildings felt cold, the noise too sharp. But when she took the stage beside Clay, speaking not as an Ellington, but as a woman who had chosen another kind of power, the audience leaned in. She told them about the truck, about the mud, about how dignity could be grown, watered, and harvested like anything else. By the end, people stood. Some wept. Clay grinned at her backstage and said, "Told you they needed to hear it." On the way home, they stopped at a small diner tucked along the highway. The waitress, a young woman with tired eyes and chipped nail polish, stared at Reese. "You're her," she said. "The truck lady." Reese blinked. Sorry? You gave that speech. The one about starting over." I'm thinking of leaving my job, starting a flower farm. My grandma left me 5 acres. I just needed to hear someone say it was possible." Reese reached across the counter and took her hand. "It is." And that's when she knew this was her new empire, built not on profit margins, but on moments like this. Back at the farm, life pressed on. The seasons didn't care about media, coverage, or conferences. The goats still needed milking, the peppers needed picking. Clay, ever patient, reminded her of that in his own way by bringing her a basket of fresh tomatoes and saying, "These waited for you." They held another community day, this time for families who had never stepped foot on a farm. There was music, fresh lemonade, and booths where kids could plant seeds in egg cartons. Reese knelt next to a little boy with big eyes and whispered, "This will grow. Just give it time." He looked at the dirt-filled shell and asked, "Like you?" She smiled. "Exactly like me." That night, exhausted and sunburnt, Reese sat on the back steps, sipping iced tea, while Clay tuned a guitar he barely knew how to play. "You changed," he said suddenly. She raised a brow. "In a bad way?" "In a big way," he clarified. "You went from running away to running things." She looked down at her hands, still stained from beet juice. "Funny, I don't feel like I'm running anymore." "Because you're home," he said. She nodded, slow and certain. "Yeah, I really am." Later that week, a group of volunteers helped erect a new sign near the front gate. Simple, wood-burned, carved by hand. It read, "Second Chance Farms Rooted in Grit." Grown in Grace. Clay added a smaller plaque beneath it, almost as an afterthought. Started with a stranger in a truck. They never tried to outgrow the story. Instead, they honored it. Every season, Reese found a new way to give someone else a beginning, a mentorship, a loan, a truck, sometimes all three. And every time she'd see a spark, recognition, hope, the tremble of someone daring to believe again. She knew that look. It had once stared back at her from the cracked mirror of a borrowed farmhouse bathroom, the night she thought she'd lost everything. Now, it was everywhere, blooming, growing, becoming. The autumn that followed felt like a long, golden exhale. It came in gentle, first in the crispness of the morning air, then in the slow blush of the trees that lined the gravel drive. Every leaf seemed to turn with intention, as if the earth itself had paused to admire the work Reese and Clay had poured into the land. The farm looked like a painting, but it felt like a heartbeat, one that pulsed through everything they touched. Harvest season was a flurry. Neighbors pitched in without being asked. Teenagers who once came reluctantly with their schools now returned on weekends to help. The barn became a makeshift depot, baskets overflowing with potatoes, squash, apples, and jars of preserves Reese had started labeling with handwritten tags that read, "From soil to soul." One afternoon, a man showed up in a dusty rental car, older, stern-looking, the kind of face that had been behind desks and inside boardrooms for decades. Reese was sorting cranberries by size when he approached. He took off his sunglasses. Her breath caught. It was her father. For a moment, everything in her stilled. The sounds of the farm, the cluck of hens, the creak of the gate, the hum of distant voices, all faded into a thick, slow silence. He cleared his throat. "I saw your interview." She didn't move. He gestured awkwardly toward the fields. "You've done something real here." Reese felt the ache of old wounds stirring just beneath the skin. She stood, brushing dirt from her knees, and looked him in the eye. "I didn't do it for your approval." "I know," he said softly. "That's what makes it matter." They sat on the porch, not like family, like history being sifted. He told her about the board, stepping down, about how Ellington Motors was slowly turning its gaze towards sustainability. He didn't ask her to come back, didn't even suggest it. Instead, he asked her for something unexpected. "Teach me," he said. She blinked. "What?" "Teach me what I missed about this, about what makes it work. I spent my life scaling. I forgot how to root." It wasn't an apology, not quite, but it was honest, and maybe that was enough. For 3 days, he stayed in the guest room over the barn. He followed Clay around with a notebook, listened to Reese speak about compost and crop rotation and community, asked questions, stayed quiet when he didn't understand, helped stack hay bales without complaint, even when he pulled something in his back. Reese watched him from a distance. How small he looked now, how human. And on his last night when they sat under the stars beside the fire pit, he handed her something wrapped in cloth. It was a photograph. Her as a baby, held in his arms on the hood of a car. "You were always meant to drive something," he said. "I just didn't realize it wouldn't be a machine." She didn't answer. She just held the photo close to her chest. Clay found her in the barn an hour later, crying quietly into the hay. He didn't say anything, just wrapped his arms around her and let her fall apart. When she could finally speak, she said, "I didn't think I needed this." Clay nodded. Sometimes healing shows up late, doesn't mean it's less real. By the end of October, the first frost painted the edges of the field silver. They celebrated with cider and an outdoor movie night, a white sheet strung between 2 apple trees, a projector humming softly in the background. Kids snuggled in sleeping bags, parents clutched mugs of something warm. Reese stood beside the truck, the original one, the one that started it all. It had a new driver now, a woman in her 40s, recently divorced, fresh from a long drive, and a longer silence. Reese had met her only that morning, but she'd recognized the weight in her shoulders. "I've got nowhere to go," the woman had said. Reese handed her the keys without hesitation. "Then start here." When the truck pulled away that night, its taillights glowing like twin hearts in the dark, Reese felt something release inside her. Not loss, not even nostalgia, just peace. Clay came up beside her, a blanket over both their shoulders. "You okay?" he asked. She leaned her head against his. "I think I finally believe it all happened for a reason. Even the hard parts, especially the hard parts." They stood there until the projector clicked off, until the last child was carried home asleep in someone's arms, until the stars spilled across the sky like confetti. The next morning, Reese woke to a strange stillness. She stepped outside and found Clay sitting on the swing, cradling something in his hands. A tiny bundle, soft, breathing. "A kitten?" she asked, bewildered. "Found her in the barn," he said. Or she found me, hard to tell. The kitten stretched and let out a squeaky yawn. Reese laughed and scratched behind its ears. You gonna name her? Clay shrugged. I was thinking, Grace. Reese's smile softened. Yeah, that fits. They sat there in silence, the three of them, wrapped in the hush of early morning, in the gentle truth of a life they never saw coming, but now couldn't imagine living without. And somewhere far down the road, a truck carried a woman into her own new beginning, because kindness has a way of echoing, and stories, once rooted, grow forever. Winter rolled in quiet and slow, blanketing the hills in hush and white. The snow arrived in layers. First a dusting, then a proper storm, the kind that closed roads and made the world feel like it had hit pause. Reese stood by the kitchen window one morning, holding a steaming mug, watching the fields disappear beneath. The rising tide of snow. She didn't miss the city, not the noise, not the sharp-edged calendars or the scramble of high heels across lobby floors. She missed nothing except perhaps her mother's old laugh, a sound that now only lived in memory. Inside the farmhouse, the wood stove crackled. The walls, once bare, were now lined with framed snapshots, community harvests, smiling volunteers, goats in sweaters, a group of kids beaming beside their first rows of planted beans. But the centerpiece, hung quietly above the mantel, was a photo Clay had taken the summer before. Reese, dirt-smudged and smiling, stood between two rows of sunflowers, holding out a basket of radishes like an offering. Below it, in small script, the frame read, "You grew here." That winter Reese started writing her first book. She hadn't planned to, but the words spilled from her like meltwater, like they'd been waiting. Page after page, she poured out the story, not just of the truck or the farm, but of how people choose each other, how sometimes a second chance doesn't arrive wrapped in clarity, but in mud and exhaustion and the weight of a stranger's trust, how love grows where it is fed, not with perfection, but with patience. She titled it Soil and Soul. Clay cried when he read the first draft. Snow piled higher, and yet the farm didn't sleep. Inside the greenhouse, built from salvaged windows and stubborn hope, Reese tended to winter greens. The air inside stayed warm with breath and effort, and the scent of living things kept the dark at bay. Sometimes, school groups would still come, bundled in layers, cheeks pink, eyes wide as they tasted fresh spinach or learned how a compost bin stays active even in the cold. Reese loved those visits, especially the way the kids always left quieter, like the land had taught them something they hadn't expected. One evening, a package arrived. No return address, just her name in delicate penmanship. Inside, a letter and a key. The letter was from the woman who had driven off in the old truck. "I made it to Arizona," it read, "started over. I've got a little plot of land now, chickens even. I don't know how to thank you, so I won't try. Instead, I'm sending you this, a spare key to the truck, just in case someone else ever needs it." Reese held the key in her palm. It was warm, somehow. She hung it by the door, on a nail beside Clay's favorite hat. Just in case, the farm's first holiday season was magic, handmade wreaths, candles, in every window. A tree decorated not with ornaments, but with tiny tags of gratitude, written by visitors on scraps of old paper. "Thank you for showing me how to begin. This place helped me breathe again. You reminded me I matter." Clay built a sleigh out of reclaimed barnwood and attached it to the tractor. They handed out hot cocoa and let kids ride through the snow, wrapped in quilts and joy. It wasn't fancy, but it was unforgettable. On New Year's Eve, the two of them stood out in the field, looking up at the stars. A single lantern floated, skyward, Junie's idea. It carried a slip of paper that read, "Let what matters rise." Reese leaned into Clay's side. "You ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't stopped that day? If I hadn't borrowed your truck?" He rapped. His arm around her shoulders. Nope, because you did. And every road since then led here. That night, Reese couldn't sleep. She crept downstairs, pulled on her boots, and walked out into the frozen quiet. The moon lit everything silver. Her breath rose like ghosts. She went to the barn, opened the door. There, curled beside the goats, was Grace the kitten, now bigger, but still wild-eyed and loyal. Reese sat in the straw, pulling her coat tight, and whispered into the dark, "Thank you. Not to anyone in particular, but to everything. The land, the pain, the letting go, the beginning again, because none of it had broken her. It had made her." The next morning, the first thaw set in. Just a hint, a drop of water sliding down a fence post, the faint smell of earth beneath the snow. Spring was coming, she could feel it in her bones. Reese stood on the porch with Clay, sipping coffee and watching the sun rise over a farm built from second chances. And somewhere out there, on another road, someone would pull up in that old truck, engine rumbling, heart heavy, not knowing what waited for them just around the next bend. But Reese would, because she'd been that someone, and she had built a life that could hold them too. So, if you're still here, if you made it through every bend in this road, every quiet ache and sudden bloom, then maybe this story found you at the right time. Maybe you've known what it's like to be lost, to feel like life moved ahead while you stood still. Maybe you've handed someone your trust and hoped they didn't break it. Or maybe, like Reese, you've wondered if starting over means losing everything or finding what really matters. We don't always get a truck pulling up in a dusty field, or a stranger with kind eyes, or a farm that somehow grows more than food. But we do get moments, tiny ones, a shared look, a hand reaching back, a chance to pause and say, "I'm still here, I'm still trying," and that matters. If this story meant something to you, if it stirred something soft and stubborn in your chest, then carry that with you. Let it linger. Let it become the soil of your next brave thing. Not all partnerships come with contracts or rings. Some come with silence, with understanding, with the quiet decision to stay when it would be easier to leave. Like Clay did, like Reese did, like we all can. So if someone ever shows up needing your help, muddy boots, broken past, no plan, maybe you'll remember this, and maybe you'll say, "Here, take the keys, let's see where this goes." Because kindness, like land, grows whatever you plant in it. And sometimes that grows into love, into love.